Okay, let's get back. We're starting back in chapter 26, Schizophrenia and Other Psychotic Disorders. People with schizophrenia, they may hear voices that other people can't hear. They may believe that other people are reading their minds, controlling their thoughts, or plotting to harm them. This obviously can terrify people with this illness. It can cause them to withdraw into themselves, become very emotionally unstable, and detach from reality altogether. What do y'all think about my backdrop? Does that help with schizophrenia? Yeah. The word schizophrenia is derived from two Greek words, schizo and phren. So we have a mind that has split from reality, not a split personality. I didn't say that. Contrary to some popular belief, schizophrenia is not split personality or multiple personalities. The word schizophrenia does mean a split mind, but it refers to a disruption of the usual balance between emotions and thinking. Schizophrenia is a group of severe brain disorders in which people interpret their reality very differently, very abnormally. Schizophrenia may result in some combination of hallucinations, delusions, disordered thinking, and behaviors. The ability of people with schizophrenia to function normally and to care for themselves tends to deteriorate over time. So once the diagnosis of schizophrenia is made, it's usually late teens or 20s, and then their abilities tend to deteriorate from that point forward. Schizophrenia is a chronic condition. It does require lifelong treatments and therapies and medications. The diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia: for someone to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, a person must meet the criteria that is spelled out in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM. The diagnosis of schizophrenia involves ruling out all other medical conditions, health disorders, or problems, and then determining that the symptoms are not due to a substance abuse, due to a medication, or due to a medical condition. So before we can say, okay, schizophrenia is the diagnosis, we've got to make sure that there's not something else causing this bizarre behavior or these thoughts or this irrational mood or instability, right? So once we've ruled out that it's not any other cause, it's not another substance or a medication or something we're giving them for a medical problem that's causing this adverse reaction and this confusion and this instability, then we can assume that they're going to meet the criteria for schizophrenia. The criteria for schizophrenia, they have to have at least 2 of the common symptoms of the schizophrenia disorder. At least 2, being delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, disorganized or catatonic behaviors, the presence of negative symptoms. 2 of these have to be present for a significant amount of time during 1 month. They have to experience significant impairment in their ability to work, attend school, or perform normal daily tasks. And they have to have had these symptoms for at least 6 months. Schizophrenia is probably, and that is italicized, caused by a combination of factors. Anytime you look at why researchers think there's a cause, you can find numerous schools of thought on that. So we have genetic predispositions, biochemical dysfunctions, psychological factors, psychosocial stressors. It's probably caused from one or more of these areas added together in combination in different settings. It's not really known what causes schizophrenia. Why does someone grow up to have a break from reality? But researchers do believe that a combination of genetics and environment contribute to the development of the disease. Neuroimaging studies do show a difference in the brain structures as well as in the central nervous systems of those individuals who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia. The researchers are not certain about the significance of the changes that you can see in the neuroimaging, but they do support evidence that schizophrenia is a brain disease. It does require treatment that is comprehensive and multidisciplinary. Although medications are essentially the cornerstone of treating someone with schizophrenia, once the psychosis begins to recede with the treatment of medications, then there are also psychological, psychosocial treatments that are also important. We've got to teach them how to behave. What's the diagnosis? What does it mean? What are the symptoms? You can't just give them a medication and clear the psychosis. Does that make sense? There's a lot of education you need to do. Many communities have programs that are set up to help people with schizophrenia after they have gotten well in treatment and after they are discharged into the community. We want to help them with job placement, housing. There are several self-help groups in place, and there are crisis prevention lines that they can call, mental health centers that they can rely on. There's usually a case manager or someone that's on the healthcare team will help them find a healthcare manager in the community. The mental health centers will help them be able to have a contact person, a support person, and that's also very good for the family members as well, to have someone to call and ask, what do I do, where do I go, how do I start? With the appropriate treatment, most of your individuals with schizophrenia can manage their condition. It is lifelong. It requires lifelong treatment and therapies. But if they adhere to those therapies and treatments, it can be managed. Of all of your mental health disorders that we've talked about in the previous semester or that we will talk about this semester, schizophrenia is the most likely one to cause long hospitalization stays, disruption in the family pattern. It is very expensive to the public. Most of the time, your persons with schizophrenia do not hold jobs or jobs for very long or jobs that offer benefits and insurance. But wait a minute, I just said it's a very lengthy hospital stay. So whom do you think is paying for that lengthy hospital stay? We are. The government. The public. Right? And right off the bat, just saying someone has schizophrenia causes some individuals to have a lot of anxiety. Just the diagnosis, just the word. Causes a lot of fears. It's usually fears because they don't understand the diagnosis or what it entails. People with schizophrenia oftentimes do not make sense when they talk. They do not put things together in a way that we can understand what their meanings are. They may sit for hours without moving at all or without talking at all. Again, remember I said they become very self-absorbed, self-withdrawn. They don't interact a lot. Sometimes your people with schizophrenia seem perfectly normal, and you'll think, well, there's not anything wrong with this patient. I couldn't tell you how many times I've assigned the students to a schizophrenic patient who's been on their meds for a couple of weeks, and they're beginning to stabilize. Their psychosis is beginning to recede. And the student will say, there's nothing wrong with my patient. They're normal. Ask me after lunch. If you develop those rapports with your patient and you begin to develop a little bit of trust and they begin to start talking about things, not just answering your questions, not just giving you that recorded feedback, Sometimes you'll be in the middle of a conversation and it's all making sense and it's all going great. And then all of a sudden they'll start talking about what they're really thinking. And you go, huh? Wait a minute. That didn't make sense. That wasn't even a part of what I was asking. And the deeper you get into the conversation, they may or may not elaborate on what their true thoughts and their delusions and their perceptions and what types of hallucinations, if they suffer from hallucinations. So they can hold it together for a period of time, and they can look very quote-unquote normal, but the psychosis may still be there, and it'll start with little things that you're going, no, I don't think that made sense to me. I'm not sure, but I don't think that made sense to me. And then as the conversation evolves and you let them take the lead of the conversation, you might be surprised what you end up talking about that doesn't make sense at all. I mean, it's just not normal to have those thoughts. Well, that's your schizophrenic patient. If at all possible, you want them to elaborate and talk. But when you go to clinicals, you'll have specific questions, and a lot of them, that you'll need to ask. So you direct the focus of conversation and then let them take it. And you might learn a lot of things that aren't overtly apparent right in the very beginning. Yes? North Alabama Regional is not closing currently. They have revoked that decision. Mm-hmm. So I hope all of you will get to go there this semester. Yay. The nature of this disorder. Schizophrenia disturbs your patient's thought process. Certainly it disturbs their perception and their affect. Well, what is the affect that we're talking about? It's the emotions, the way that feelings are portrayed. When you look at somebody, you describe an affect and you kind of get a sense of how they're feeling today. If they're bawling and squalling, snot flying, they ain't feeling too good. That's their affect, They look sad. So thought disturbances are oftentimes described as a muddled way of thinking. Sometimes your schizophrenics will describe that it's just all blends together. Nothing's clear to me. I can't see where things start and stop. All of my thoughts are just kind of running together, and I get bits and pieces of all of them. Their thought disturbances are generally characterized by an inability to concentrate. They can't connect their thoughts together logically in a logical sequence of order. They just can't think clearly. Their thought process may speed up on them, and they may have racing thoughts. They have so many things going through their head, they can't stop and answer your question, because by the time that they've processed your question, they've got one answer that led them to a different thought, to a different thought, to another thought, and that's the one they blurt out. So that's racing thoughts, that's loosening of associations, or sometimes their thoughts may just slow down so much and be so profoundly slowed down they cannot concentrate and formulate an educated answer to your question. They may seem very blocked. Thought blocking does occur. It's not that they're trying to evade you. They just can't come up with the answer. It's just not readily available there for them. Their mind feels completely blank at times. They just can't think about anything. Disturbance in thinking are sometimes compared to a broken filter. A filter that allows everything in at once, or a filter that filters out everything at once. It's just like broken and they can't control it. Either everything's firing at them or nothing's firing for them. And for whatever reason, everything, when they're having those racing thoughts that enters their mind, has the same significance of importance. They can't categorize, well, that's not important, but this is important. It's all coming at them, and they can't prioritize, what do I need to do? What do I need to go to? Or where do I need to sit down and eat? Or it's just all important, and it's all there at one time. For example, they might attach the same significance to a license plate as to a question from you. When you ask them a specific question, and that license plate pops in their mind, they might rattle that off. because it has the same significance as your question to them. Do you see what I'm saying? So it is a little more challenging to communicate, and that's what we're learning. Their perception, very different. Our ability to receive sensory input and our memories, all of these play a vital role in our perception of the environment, our perception of other people. We have an internal preconceived image. Did y'all know that? We have our own notions that we came in here with. We have our own information, our own experiences to pull from. And all of these things provide us with immediate orientation to our external situations. You've all been in this room. You weren't threatened. It was okay. You had no fear coming in here again. You remember different experiences, different times, different things that, don't do that, different things that you pull from, that you remember this was a situation that I was extremely uncomfortable in, or this was a very painful situation, or this was fine, or I enjoyed this a lot. And those are your preconceived notions. Well, a schizophrenic's perception has no conscious point of reference. They have difficulty orienting themselves to their external world. Their point of reference is very skewed. This point of reference that I'm talking about is called the cognitive schemata. Let's list it on your slide there. The individual that does not have this stored knowledge of cognitive schemata becomes trapped in their own inner world. They have no reference point, and their own inner world becomes very strange to them. They begin to have traumatic interactions with the outer world because they can't pull from experience. They can't draw from memories. Everything has a very blurry reference. So everything begins to look a little suspicious, or become very paranoid, or maybe look very dangerous to them, when in fact it's not. The schizophrenic must relentlessly reevaluate all day long their environment and their common activities. Even if it's something that they did yesterday, they don't have that remembering cognitive schemata point. And even if they're on the hospital unit for weeks at a time, it is almost as if you have to tell them the same thing every day for weeks. Their affect, again, as I said, the affect is the feeling state or the emotional tone with voice or facial expression. With schizophrenia, there is a severe deterioration of their social and their occupational functioning. The prevalence in the United States is about 1% of our population. Schizophrenia is the most persistent and disabling of the major mental illnesses. It attacks people usually in their late teens and 20s, but that's not to say that we can't have a 16-year-old diagnosed with schizophrenia. I'm not saying it doesn't happen any other time. I'm just saying usually it's late teens and 20s. Now, we can certainly see someone diagnosed for the first time at 31 with schizophrenia. That would be an exception to the general rule, but it certainly could happen. You all thought you were safe, right? Nope. What is sad about that time frame that it usually occurs, think about who we're talking about. Late teens and 20s. Very, very many of you fall in that category. You are looking at life changes. You're looking at goals and futures and planning, right? And that's generally the population that schizophrenia takes over. They're beginning to realize their potential just when it's kind of snatched away from them. It affects approximately 1 in every 100 people worldwide, which accounts for that 1% of the population. I wrote down, there's 1% in the United States, but there is one in every 100 people worldwide. Yeah, still 1%, all the way around. It does affect men and women almost equally. You know, usually we say, okay, we see this more in with schizophrenia. We don't see a big gender bias. It is treatable in many cases, lifelong treatment and therapy in conjunction with the cornerstone medications that I mentioned. Psychosis and mental condition. This is what happens when there is a disorganization that involves personality and that deterioration in their functioning that I talked about, social functioning, and they have a loss of contact or a distortion with reality. All these things are kind of going on at the same time. They don't see the reality in front of them for what it is. They misperceive it. They have a loss of contact. They don't have social functioning skills that they can use any longer because it's all very confused. And they have that disorganized personality. It's a total change for them. So looking at a very smart, personable, outgoing, good grade student certainly does not exempt them from the possibility of becoming schizophrenic later on. The premorbid behavior of the patient with schizophrenia can usually be viewed in 4 phases. The premorbid phase, the period of normal functioning, there's a period of normalcy there. Even though some of the events that may contribute to the development of schizophrenia may still be occurring, there's a period of normalcy they have. A number of factors have been identified as premorbid indicators of psychosis. All of these factors can be divided into 2 categories. The first category is called early precursors. Your early precursors, this is like family history of psychiatric illnesses. Perinatal and obstetric complications. Neurobehavioral deficits. Now those are like poor motor coordination. And the second category, is personality and behavior measurements. Being very shy, and I'm certainly not saying that every shy child is predisposed to schizophrenia. I'm just saying that in your schizophrenic diagnoses, when you look back, and hindsight is 20/20, a lot of these things tend to be the same in all of those patients. Being very shy, very withdrawn, having very poor peer relationships, doing poorly in school, and demonstrating some antisocial behaviors, not really being part of a clique anywhere, not really caring to fit in. And as I said, there's a normal period. They just have normal functioning and nobody really catches anything. And in the prodromal phase, or the second phase, it can last from weeks to years. When we talk about a prodrome of an illness, it means the signs and symptoms that come right before it's an acute, fully developed illness, right? So most of the time we don't see those until looking back. We don't look for a problem before it happens. The prodromal phase of schizophrenia begins with a change from their premorbid functioning. Their normal, shy, withdrawn functioning. It usually extends until the onset of very obvious psychotic symptoms are present. But when are we going to start looking for a problem? When the onset of very obvious psychotic symptoms are present and we've kind of missed that prodrome stage. Phase 2, as I said, can last from weeks to years. It can be anywhere in between, months. The average length, however, of the prodromal stage is between 2 and 5 years. So we have that phase 1, that premorbid phase, and they look normal. Nobody's looking for a problem. They're just as shy, strange, don't fit in. And then they move into that phase 2, which is the change from phase 1. Something changes. And phase 2 can last a long period of time or a very short period of time. But on average, it's 2 to 5 years. Well, we said the diagnosis of schizophrenia is usually in the late teens and 20s. Well, my goodness, from 15 to 20, how many of your teenagers changed? A bunch. It's still hard to see through that prodromal stage until the obvious psychotic symptoms begin.
Is this sort of like a slow and steady process? So it's so slow that you don't really see this break in your mouse?
Well, it can only last weeks. It doesn't have to last years, but on average, 2 to 5 years. But it can be a much quicker process than maybe I'm leading you to believe. It can fall all apart in a matter of weeks. Read over the slide. I don't have to read it to you. Ideas of reference. The ideas of reference for your schizophrenic patient that are listed in the last bullet. These are the kinds of things that involve a belief that some casual events or some person's casual remarks or etc. are somehow directly being related to the person with schizophrenia. They misinterpret things. They think that everything is really aimed at them. It's just very casual interactions. We'll just flip a switch and they'll honestly believe. All the paranoia kicks in, and everything that you say or do somehow directly relates to them. They don't know why you don't like them. They haven't done anything to you, but they're convinced that you're out to hurt them. You're conspiring and plotting against them, or what you said was aimed directly at them, and you may not even have noticed them in the background. You didn't even have to direct your conversation to them. So that is ideas of reference. They just think that casual remarks or comments or events tend to refer to themselves, when in fact they're not. When it's recognized in this phase, the prodromal phase, there is a possibility for improved prognosis long term, but the prodromal phase is not usually recognized. That's not usually what happens. But if someone is recognized to be in the phases just prior to an acute mental illness of schizophrenia, and we can start treatment during this phase, they have an improved prognosis for long-term treatment. If we can identify the problem, focus on cognitive functioning, enhance their coping skills, help them with actively engaging in their reality and in their environment, we can help them out long term. We can't fix it. We can't change it. But we can decrease what's fixing to happen. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Because we said the prodromal phase is just prior to the acutely ill phase. Now, there is some controversy over giving medications during the prodromal phase. You know, you're going to find people, pros, cons, 2 and 4, for anything, right? So it shouldn't surprise you that there's a lot of people that think you do not need to give medications until there's an active break from reality, active psychosis. That's when you need to start putting these meds in. Some people say, no, if we can ward off the active psychosis, that's what we want to do. Well, you don't know if the psychosis is ever going to start. You don't know how long it's going to be. You may give them meds for 5 years. So you see the argument there? I don't have an opinion either way. But there is a lot of controversy over giving meds in this phase. The research suggests that since it isn't actually truly a schizophrenic stage, a schizophrenic break yet, that the benefits of medication do not outweigh the risks of taking the actual the medicine. You want to give these people medications, and all these medications have really heavy side effects to them and make a lot of changes, and you don't even know when they're going to become psychotic or if they're going to become psychotic. What do y'all think? If you had a loved one who you could know was in a prodromal stage just prior to an acute diagnosis of psychotic reaction, and would you want them to be medicated if it could prevent that, or would you say absolutely not? Not until we know for sure. Not until they're psychotic. Okay. Well, you can see where the controversy comes in then, can't you? Phase 3, schizophrenic. We have hit that acute deterioration and that psychotic episode. This is an active phase of schizophrenia. The symptoms are prominent, meaning they have taken over. Delusions, hallucinations, illusions. I don't have illusions up there, but it should fall here. That's illusions with an I.
What happens when they, like even in this stage, when the family refuses to, they just let them act like fools?
Most oftentimes, if the patient and or the family members are refusing medication, it comes down to the patient displaying public events that put them or others at risk for safety, and they get committed. I guess I could turn that around, Denise, and say what happens when someone refuses to stop doing drugs and drives on the interstate 110 and won't act right.
Well, I mean, she believes she's being gassed all the time and that there's bugs all in her house.
You can force treatment, but it's...
she's called all these federal agencies to come check
Right. You can force treatment, but there is a period of paperwork and legalities and court committals.
So they just let them
Until it looks like they're jeopardizing the safety of themselves or others significantly, they're not going to infringe commitment on them. These individuals experiencing delusions, hallucinations, and illusions, these are the psychotic symptoms that cause the severe impairment that they have with their reality and with others. In their work, their social relations, their self-care. Have you ever had this, and this is the only way I know to even, I'm certainly not trying to make light of it, but to even try to explain it. Have you ever had this obnoxious song that you don't even like get stuck in your head? Oh no, don't say that, because that's the one that gets stuck in my head. Oh my gosh. Don't say it again. And so it's just very annoying. But have you ever tried to get away from your own thoughts? Shut them off, make them stop, go away. How many of you have a lot of success with not thinking about something you don't want to think about even though it's on your mind? No, not many of us, huh? Well, what if those thoughts were so prominent and dominant and they were hallucinations and delusions about everybody around you and everything around you and every situation around you? You can't not think it's real because you can't not think what you're thinking. All right, so then we move into the residual phase, phase 4, where we start to kind of see a cycle begin. We're almost back to that prodromal phase, which is prior to the acute illness, right? With schizophrenia, there are periods of exacerbation and remission. That's what we're looking at here. It gets really, really, really bad, and then it gets a little bit better, but never good. The residual phase is the time period that follows that active phase of psychoses and mental illness. The symptoms either begin to disappear or may be completely gone, but they're certainly not still the prominent behavior. Negative symptoms may continue to remain. When I say negative symptoms, we're going to talk about that in detail in a little bit. But that's things like the flat affect, difficulty performing their roles. Negative symptoms and difficulties often will increase with every period of residual phase. When we come back to the residual phase, we'll see more negative symptoms, more problems. And then as they begin to work through their residual phase, when each time has more negative symptoms and more problems, that acute phase is going to hit again. that acute psychotic phase will hit again. If that were your existence, what would you want? I hear people saying I would take my own life. So I'm just trying to help you walk in their shoes, even for just a moment, as miserable as that would be. Yes?
People basically reach through residual phase, they're diagnosed, and then with medication they can pretty much live in that second phase.
Well, that's a good question. The prognosis for someone with schizophrenia, as I said, usually we don't diagnose them until they've hit that active, full-blown stage, because if you can catch them in any stage up to that, it's rare. But yes, we diagnose them. They have their full-blown active schizophrenic psychosis phase. They end up on medications and treatments and therapies, and we get to residual phase, and we hope that those medications can hold them essentially in the residual phase, but we still have periods of breakthrough psychosis. That active phase is going to come back around, and it's at that time, even if they have been very good at taking their medications and they have adhered to their regimen specifically, we do have to make changes. Sometimes the meds have to be changed with every active phase again, and we hope that we can keep them in the residual, and certainly by getting them on meds and by keeping them therapeutic on their meds, we can take what would have been a very up and down, high and low, crazy period to maybe more like a squiggle, if that makes sense, so that we can keep them from going into that very, very bad form of psychosis and active hallucinations and whatever. But we want them essentially, yes, to try to stay in that residual phase, and yes, that's probably as good as we can get. And every time that happens and we come back around to that residual phase, there are more negative symptoms that weren't there the last time we came. They need treated. Now they might need new meds. So it's really a never-ending process of treatment and therapies. Yes, ma'am. You know, not usually, because it's a chemical brain matter makeup. It's a norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine. Those things are not being produced in quantities that are required to maintain that level of emotional stability and behavior. So usually once that your individual has reached that full-blown psychotic stage, you know, it is unlikely that they're going to just be able to have those neurotransmitters in the brain at the levels that they need them. So probably they will require medications more often than not. I would think if they didn't, that would be an exception. A full baseline function, as I just said, not common. Even on the meds, we're not going back to how it was prior to the break. Not going to get there again. Their baseline is considered as good as it got, ever. Well, their next baseline on meds, when we get back to that residual phase, not quite as high every time. So y'all get where this goes with mental illness over a period of years and years and years? Factors associated with a positive prognosis include these here listed on your slide. Positive prognosis does tend to be a little bit more female-based because females tend to adhere to their medication regimen more than men. I'm just saying. And obviously, the last one says if there was no family history of schizophrenia, you have a little better prognosis than if you're coming from a long history of psychotic episodes from mom and grandpa and Uncle Gene and whatever. Predisposing factors. Well, how do we know, or how do we look at these trends and come up with who's going to have schizophrenia? What do we think? Well, let's discuss that, and then we'll go to break. We came back at 40, so we'll go at 40, okay? Predisposing factors, biological influences, and genetics. There's a lot of information and statistics out there that will tell you that genetics are going to be a huge part in determining whether or not someone is at risk for developing schizophrenia. We've already said that, if you have a history of schizophrenia in your family, your prognosis is not as good, or your risk for developing it is much higher. I get that, and I believe that. In the beginning, we said there's no one thing that causes it. So with that said, either parent could be diagnosed with schizophrenia, and a child could not ever have suffered from schizophrenia in their life. But they're at much higher risk. Although the precise cause of schizophrenia unknown, we've identified certain factors that seem to increase the risk of developing it or to trigger schizophrenia tendencies. Having a family history of schizophrenia puts you 5 to 10% higher risk for developing schizophrenia. So you could double that if both parents had schizophrenia. Stressful life circumstances. Okay, that can put you at risk. So we're all at risk now, right? Older paternal age. If a child is born to a parent that is nearing, a certain age, 45 up, there's a little bit of an increased risk for developing schizophrenia. Taking psychoactive drugs during the adolescence and young adulthood period could trigger schizophrenia later on. There are also twin studies done with schizophrenia. Your monozygotic twins are much more likely to develop schizophrenia than your dizygotic twins. I don't know why. Don't ask me why. And this happens even if they're raised in separate environments. If one of them, monozygotic twins, has schizophrenia, separated at birth, raised in different environments, they both have schizophrenia. That's not so much in your dizygotic, but does that not lend to some of the research that it's got to have some genetic base to it? I mean, would you think? Children adopted into very good and stable homes whose biological parent was schizophrenic still develop schizophrenia. And this is in comparison to children with no history of mental illness adopted by a mentally ill parent who did not develop schizophrenia, but grew up to take care of the parent. So with that said, you have to believe there are some genetic predispositions. Okay. As we move to the next researcher. Biochemical influences. Problems with certain naturally occurring brain chemicals, including the neurotransmitters that I just mentioned, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, glutamate. These also may contribute to being at an increased risk for schizophrenia. We make these in our brain. Some individuals, for whatever reason, make too much of one, not enough of the other, and they develop schizophrenia or other disorders that we're also going to talk about that are related to neurotransmitters. At any rate, they have an abnormality in whatever chemical it is causing that type of behavior. It's either being produced in too much of a quantity or not enough of a quantity. On the top left, you have a normal control male brain. And on the top right, you have someone diagnosed with schizophrenia, and it's a male. All the red and hot spots you can see in the schizophrenic patient. And on the bottom left, you have a normal control scan of a female, and on the bottom right, you have a schizophrenic female scan of the brain. I don't really pretend to know what all of the colors and the hot spots mean, but I can look at it and see there's a difference. Right? You can look at it and see there is something anatomically different. So your anatomical changes or your abnormalities between your white and gray matter distribution are there. And it seems to be there in both individuals, male and female, with schizophrenia. And a physiological influence. With your physiological influence, there are some factors that have been implicated: viral infections, anatomical abnormalities, histological changes in the brain. Exposures to viruses, toxins, or malnutrition while in the womb has led some researchers to believe that predisposed an individual to schizophrenia. particularly if it occurred in the first and second trimester, and particularly when it was influenza. The structural brain abnormalities, when we talk about that, we're talking about a ventricular enlargement. Seems to be the most consistent finding in someone with schizophrenia. They have an enlarged ventricle. Cerebral changes. Some research says that the change is in the cellular development from exposure to that influenza that we talked about in the second trimester. Or it may be from an infection that the mother had while she was pregnant. I don't think people really know what causes the cerebral changes, just that they are there, and we're all kind of guessing. Some studies have reported that there is a link between temporal lobe epilepsy. If the seizures originate in the temporal lobe, they are predisposed to schizophrenia. So you have various different physical conditions that researchers have linked with maybe possibly developing schizophrenia. You know, studies, all they do is theorize, right? They take a lot of different people and they try to see if any of them have the same environment or chemical balance or, you know, parental, genetic, familial. So the studies, some of them have theorized a link between these various different physiological influences in the development of schizophrenia. For example, epilepsy, as I said, particularly in the temporal lobe, was linked in studies to schizophrenia, as was all of these conditions listed on the slide. So we looked at all that and we said, you know what? Every one of these cannot predispose you to schizophrenia. Now that might have been one or two here or one or two there. So these theories are not really as credible now as they once were. Researchers now are beginning to put most of their focus time and most of their studies of schizophrenia as a true brain disorder, as a true problem in the brain, not so much as a birth trauma or myxedema trauma or something like that. You know, they can't use all of their money and research grants and time and effort chasing down every single possibility. So they're looking at it more as it is a brain condition. It is a brain disorder. There is something in the brain that is abnormal, that's not happening that should, or that is happening that shouldn't. Your psychosocial theories probably developed early on out of a real lack of information. So now as we get more information, we're moving more into the thought that it is a brain disorder. We're looking more at that biological connection. Environmental influences, sociocultural factors, downward drift hypothesis, and stressful life. Well, your sociocultural factors, researchers somewhere linked poverty with the development of schizophrenia. I don't know. The only way that I can think about poverty being linked to it might have been the nutritional value that they might not have been afforded or deficits they might have had to grow up with as far as not having the money to provide. The downward drift hypothesis says that there are poor social conditions that are seen as a consequence of rather than a cause of schizophrenia. So that's kind of the opposite of what the sociocultural factor just said, right? The downward drift says you get schizophrenia and then you start seeing those poor social conditions. Not you have poor social conditions and develop schizophrenia because of it. Like I said, every researcher is going to have their own set of research and they're going to convince you of that. Stressful life events. These are the ones that may be associated with an exacerbation of schizophrenic symptoms, and they increase the rates of relapse. If one situation triggered that break from reality and the patient experienced that loss and that psychotic episode, it is likely that when that stressful event, or should another stressful event holding the same value to that patient comes around again, it's liable to trigger that psychotic episode again. So that stressful life situation whether it's the same or a different one, could trigger that schizophrenic episode again. If you know me, you know I like the transactional model. The transactional model says, you know, it's got to be biologically based, but there's no one set of influence that has caused it. It's got to be a lot of different factors, both internal and external, out of the environment. You can't just say one thing causes this. There's no single theory or hypothesis that can give us a clear-cut explanation for schizophrenia. And that's what the transactional model says. All right. Let's take 5. Okay, the types of schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders that we're going to talk about. Hello. Sit down. Okay. We have disorganized schizophrenia, catatonic schizophrenia, which has 2 subtypes, paranoid schizophrenia, and undifferentiated schizophrenia. Disorganized schizophrenia is a chronic variety with a flat or an inappropriate affect, silliness and incongruent giggling. These are common behaviors, very bizarre behaviors. Their social interaction is impaired. They don't react appropriately in social settings. Your catatonic schizophrenia, catatonic stupor, this is characterized by an extreme psychomotor retardation, like just non-existent movement. The patient at this stage is usually mute, and posturing may be common, meaning they may sit in one specific posture for a long, long period of time, and you may actually physically have to sit them, but don't forget about them, because wherever you sit them, they're going to still be there when your shift's over. Okay? And just the opposite end of that is catatonic excitement. This is the extreme psychomotor agitation, just purposeless movements and pacing and rocking, movements that you really have to watch out for them hurting themselves because they just can't be still for any period of time. Oh, y'all probably wanted that, huh? Paranoid schizophrenia, I think we've talked enough about that to where it makes sense to you. It's characterized by these paranoid delusions. A delusion is a false belief. If you believe something and it's delusional, you can become very paranoid about whatever is trying to convince you that what you believe is untrue. No, you're wrong. I know this. I feel this. I saw this. And you become their focus of paranoia then, by trying to convince them what they know isn't true. The client may become very argumentative with you, even hostile and aggressive when you try to go against their paranoid delusions and try to explain to them, I understand that this is what you believe, and I understand that you believe this is true. I don't share that belief. I don't have any proof of that. I can't find that. So you do it in those kinds of ways. You just don't say, no, that ain't true, and you know it. You know that didn't happen. You know those people ain't out to get you because they don't know it, okay? They don't know what you're saying is true as opposed to what they believe is not true. So don't get into a power struggle of arguing. You will lose. It's like arguing with a cuss why 3-year-old. Cuss why. Undifferentiated schizophrenia. This is characterized by bizarre behaviors that do not meet the criteria outlined for the other types of schizophrenia. You know, the DSM says you got to have these or those to go in this box and that box. Well, undifferentiated schizophrenia doesn't fit in any of the other boxes of schizophrenia, so it's undifferentiated. Okay? There are delusions and hallucinations in undifferentiated schizophrenia that are very prominent still. but it either doesn't hit all of the criteria for disorganized or catatonic or paranoid, or maybe there is no paranoia, so that takes it out of paranoid schizophrenia, but it doesn't quite fit under the catatonic excitation or catatonic stupor. It just doesn't fit anywhere else, the symptoms, so it's undifferentiated. But you don't confuse yourself. It does have delusions, and hallucinations are still present in undifferentiated. We have residual schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorders. Someone with residual schizophrenia, this diagnosis is used to diagnose a person who has a history of at least one episode of schizophrenia with prominent psychotic symptoms. What are our psychotic symptoms? Hallucinations, delusions, illusions. So they've had at least one episode of schizophrenia, and during that episode of schizophrenia, they had prominent psychotic symptoms. That's a residual. Maybe they only had the one. This is not common, that you will have one psychotic break and be totally delusional and experiencing hallucinations and not have a problem. Usually they recur. But to be residual, you have to have had at least one. Schizoaffective disorder. Someone who has schizoaffective disorder, they have the schizophrenic symptoms that we've been talking about, and it is accompanied by a strong element of other symptoms. Symptoms that usually are associated with mood disorders. So you have your schizo, which is the psychotic part, affective, which is the mood part of it. So this patient has the psychosis and symptoms that are usually associated with mood disorders. They may either experience very manic periods, those racing thoughts, or they may experience depressive periods. But they have the schizophrenic symptoms and mood disorder symptoms at the same time going on. We have someone who might be diagnosed with a brief psychotic disorder. A brief psychotic disorder is very sudden. It is a sudden onset of psychotic symptoms that are followed by severe psychosocial stressors. I'm sorry, they're following a severe psychosocial stressor. Brief psychotic episode, your patient it's very sudden. They do have psychotic symptoms, but it happened just following some really huge stressor in their life, something really major. And then the symptoms will have to persist for at least a few weeks, but less than a month. That's why it's a brief psychotic disorder. So they persist for a few weeks, but not as long as a month. And at the end of the time period that those symptoms are there, the patient returns to their full pre-morbid or baseline level of functioning. They have a brief psychotic episode. It's brought on by something, some big stressor, something individual, something very personal, lasts a few weeks, but not longer than a month, and they return back to where they were prior to that stressful, life-changing, life-altering event. That's not really schizophrenia. That's a brief psychotic episode. But since it does have a period of psychotic symptoms, it kind of falls under schizophrenia topics, classifications. Schizophreniform. Schizophreniform disorder has the same symptoms as schizophrenia, with an exception that the duration of this disorder has been at least 1 month, but fewer than 6 months. So that's your schizophreniform. It looks just like schizophrenia, same symptoms. They last for at least 1 month, but less than 6. Delusional disorders. We talked about delusions. Those are false beliefs. They don't exist anywhere except in the patient's mind, in their belief system. These delusions are very prominent. And they don't always have to be crazy, outlandish delusions. They don't always have to think that they're the Queen of Sheba. It could just be something non-bizarre, but still false or untrue. Do y'all understand what I'm saying? They don't have to think they're Elvis's widow. They could think something very normal, but it still be untrue and be fixated and prominent. Some subtypes of delusional disorders. The erotomanic type, this is the individual that believes that someone, usually of a higher social status, is in love with them. This is kind of like the basis for the stalkers, you know. They see some celebrity or some higher socioeconomic status person, and for whatever reason, they develop this delusional disorder and fully and totally believe that that person is in love with them. That they are soulmates, they have a significant bond and a connection. The grandiose type of delusional disorder. Now these are your patients who have irrational ideas regarding their own worth, what talents they might possess, their knowledge, the level of power that they have over others, all delusional. We have several patients, usually at any point in time, we have several patients that believe they have a lot of government classified information, and that as soon as someone calls them, they can fix all of the problems because they're that smart and they have all the answers. So that's your grandiose type. They usually think they have a lot more power than they do, and they're a lot smarter than they really are, and they have a lot more pull and clout than they actually do. And then your jealous, jealous type of delusional disorder. You cannot convince this person that their significant other is faithful. They have this irrational idea that their partner is unfaithful and nothing that partner can say or do will prove any differently. If you stayed with them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they would swear you found some time to cheat on them. You're never going to convince this person who has a jealous type delusional disorder of anything different. Somatic types of delusional disorders are the people who have irrational beliefs that they have some kind of a physical defect or that they have some type of medical disorder or disease. Yet they go from doctor to doctor to doctor, and there are no lab results that suggest it. There is no rational explanation for why they would have it. Everything says they're normal, but they are convinced they have this illness or this ailment. A couple of semesters ago, I had a very pleasant little man, loved him, sweet as he could be. He had a somatic type of delusional disorder that went with his schizophrenia. He was convinced that he had full-blown HIV and that he was going to die. He was in the last stages of his life. There was no medical reason for him to believe that. We had taken blood tests. He had not been promiscuous. He had never been an IV drug user. I mean, none of the risk factors. But he was convinced. And he was so convinced that he kept himself away from others because he didn't want to infect them. Several students were assigned to him, and he would talk with them, but he wouldn't shake their hands. He wouldn't hold their papers or touch their ink pen or anything because he didn't want to infect them. And he was so sure that he was that sick that he would make other people sick, and he didn't want other people to die. There was no reason for him to literally believe that. But he did, and you could not convince him otherwise. Your persecutory type is a person that believes that he or she is being mistreated. They believe that people are wishing harm on them or ill will. They're being treated maliciously by others for no reason. They believe that people have an evil or a harmful influence over what happens to them. It's just as it states. They're being persecuted by strangers. People that don't even know them are out to get them. Bad things happen to them because of other people being evil and wanting to harm them. And that's your persecutory type delusion. Your shared psychotic disorder, I mean, birds of a feather flock together. There's a little bit of truth in that. Sometimes two people who have a psychotic disorder can build off of each other's psychotic disorder and begin to share the same delusion. That is called filet-a-deux. It's a delusional system that develops in a second person as a result of a very close relationship with a person who already has an existing psychotic disorder, and they both begin to just share the delusion. They both take the delusion into a very prominent part of their life. Filet-a-deux. Now, a psychotic disorder due to a general medical condition. This is when the symptoms of psychosis begin to appear, and they can include those prominent hallucinations and delusions, but in ruling out everything, we find a cause for it. Remember in the beginning I said schizophrenia is only diagnosed after we don't have a cause for it. There's no medicine we're giving them. There's no head trauma. There's nothing going on that would cause this behavior. So what we find is they have a general medical condition that's causing these hallucinations or this behavior change or these delusions. So instead of labeling them with schizophrenia, they have a psychotic disorder due to whatever, brain tumor in the frontal lobe or whatever it is that's causing those hallucinations and those delusions and that prominent behavior change. Same can be said with a substance-induced psychotic disorder. They will have the presence of prominent hallucinations as well as delusions. And these hallucinations, delusions, this psychotic behavior is the direct result from a physiological effect of a substance. Hallucinogens, yeah, we talked about those. And they cause all these delusions and paranoia and hallucinations. But if the drug wasn't there, the hallucinations may or may not be there, but they weren't there before the drug. All right, I told you we'd talk a little bit about negative and positive symptoms. These are difficult to grasp. So listen to me. The symptoms of schizophrenia are going to fall into three broad categories. We have positive symptoms, negative symptoms, and cognitive symptoms. Positive symptoms, look at me, don't write, just listen to me, I'll repeat it. I want you to listen to me, because people always get these mixed up. Your positive symptoms in a psychotic disorder are psychotic behaviors that are not seen in healthy people. People with positive symptoms lose touch with reality, and the symptoms can come and go. So positive symptoms are the psychotic symptoms that we see in our schizophrenic patient that we don't see in healthy, normal people. So positive symptoms are bad. You think positive symptoms are good, but they're not. Does that make sense? The positive symptoms is kind of like saying this person may be positive for schizophrenia, and that's a bad thing. So a positive symptom is that psychotic behavior that you see in that schizophrenic that you don't see in normal people. Okay. The symptoms, like I said, can come and go. Sometimes they are severe. At other times, they're hardly noticeable. It depends on whether the individual is receiving treatment or not. So you can still have positive symptoms, breakthrough symptoms, when they're taking meds. In schizophrenia, your positive symptoms reflect an excess or a distortion of normal function. So a positive symptom isn't good. Delusions are a positive symptom, right? That's a part of the psychotic behavior that we see in our schizophrenic, and we don't see delusions in normal, healthy people. So delusions would be a positive symptom. Delusions are the most common of schizophrenic symptoms that you will see. So when you get to your clinical experience and your patient doesn't have delusions, don't come back and tell me I'm wrong. Okay? I said it's the most common. Hyper-religiosity. Hyper-religiosity tends to be a positive symptom of schizophrenia. I don't know why, but we tend to see that a lot in your schizophrenic patients, that hyper-religious thought process that becomes so prominent. That is an excessive demonstration of an obsession with religious thoughts, ideas, biblical beliefs, reading and taking everything out of context, applying it just over the top. Thought disorders, like your paranoia. These individuals have difficulty speaking and organizing their thoughts. We've talked about why they have difficulty with organizing and prioritizing their thoughts. So this may result in what you see as them stopping their speech completely, mid-sentence. Or they may be putting together meaningless words, words that you don't know what they mean to you, but they mean something to the patient. Or they may be putting together words that don't relate to each other. Now, if it's a word that only the patient knows what it means and you don't know, you're not in that little need-to-know circle, that's a neologism. The word doesn't mean anything to anybody but the person that created the word. And if it's words that you understand, but they're strung together in a sentence that makes no sense whatsoever, it's word salad. It's like taking a sentence, tossing it up, and letting it fall where it may, and then see how much sense it makes with the words just all out of context. That's word salad. Disorganized thoughts. They have disorganized behavior. This may be shown in a number of ways, ranging from being very childlike and argumentative and silly and giggly to being very unpredictable and agitated and hostile. They're just really disorganized, so be cautious with your interactions. They may develop an extreme suspicion of others without any warning or reason. You may walk in the room, shake their hand, introduce yourself, and then all of a sudden you remind them of somebody they don't like. Well, guess what? They don't like you either now. And they don't want to talk to you anymore. You didn't do anything wrong. They have a mental illness. And that mental illness kicks in and it becomes prominent. And for whatever reason, they now think that you're against them, you're out to hurt them, maybe you're with those people who are conspiring against them. It's paranoia, and they don't do it on purpose, and you don't do anything to get it. It happens. Magical thinking. Sometimes positive symptoms might manifest themselves in what we call magical thinking. And usually when I find a patient that has magical thinking, I pretty much have to ask them, are you having this and that and these? Magical thinking is an idea that if one thinks something, it must be true. If I think that I can control the weather by snapping my fingers, I can. And I usually end up having to ask the patient, are there things that you can do other people can't do, and you have powers that nobody else knows about or possesses? Why, yes, I do. But it's not something they just come out and tell you. I made it rain yesterday by doing that. You usually have to kind of talk your way into it. But yeah, that's what magical thinking is. When we assess positive symptoms, some forms of thought that you might see in your schizophrenic patient, sometimes their cognitive symptoms are very subtle. Sometimes, like I said before, you'll think, they're kind of normal. There's really nothing wrong with my patient. Because they can fake it till they make it for a little while. So sometimes their cognitive symptoms are just going to jump out at you and you're just going to know right off the bat, well, that ain't right. And sometimes it takes a little bit longer to see where the breakdown is. But like your cognitive symptoms are a lot like your positive symptoms. They're difficult to recognize. You see the lady on here speaking niffer? What do you think that is? We just talked about that. That's a neologism. I don't have a clue what that means. It has no definition, no significance, but it means something to her. So that would be a neologism. Often these cognitive symptoms are detected only when other tests are performed. Like we ask them to do little tasks. We ask them to do a mini mental status exam that you should have on your blackboard that you should print off and take to clinical with you. Maybe then you'll see a cognitive deficit or a cognitive problem. When all day long you've been talking with them and you didn't see anything. A poor ability to understand information and to use that information to make decisions. That would be one of your forms of thought. Trouble focusing on what you're asking them or what they're saying to you or what television program is or who's up there talking in front of the room right now for group. They just have difficulty focusing. They can't hang on to what they're saying long enough. They can't pay attention. Sometimes they have problems with their working memory, meaning their ability to use information they already had and immediately put it in that environment or that new situation that they're in. Associative looseness. Associative looseness is when your patient shifts the ideas from one unrelated topic to another. Their thoughts are just all over the place. I mean, you could talk about this thing all day long, but they go from that thing to another thing to another thing, and none of them relate to each other. They just have a very loose association. Neologism we talked about. Concrete thinking, this is your literal person. If you say, I'm going to run over to the bookstore, they literally see you running to the bookstore. A concrete thinker is exactly what you say. You can't throw out those little slang things, and say, well, just give me a call sometime. What time? When? What time? Just any time. I need a time. You said give you a call. I need to know what time. See? That's concrete. They're very concrete with their environment, very concrete with their communication. And then there's clang associations. These are choices of words that are governed by sound. And we had a patient several semesters ago. He was amazing at clanging. But that's a positive symptom of schizophrenia. He could throw together a rhyme that went on till you finally just had to say, we have to stop now. We've been here 8 hours and we have to go home. Because he spoke that way. Everything he said was a rhyme and a rhyme and a rhyme. All of his words clanged. They rhymed. Some of you are shaking your head because you've been there with me before and you know who I'm talking about. And he could do that for the longest period of time till you stopped him. It was amazing and it was very entertaining to sit and just listen to how his sentences just rhymed one after the other. But it did. I got ahead of myself a little bit. Here's the word salad that I mentioned earlier. Now, everything in that square has meaning. Those are not words you're not familiar with. But when you say more money from corn to carry bottles for all the little children of paradise, every one of those words makes sense, but that sentence does not make sense. That's your word salad. It's just that grouping of words together in a random fashion that you can't make heads or tails of. Circumstantiality. If they're speaking in circumstantiality, that is a delay in reaching the point. Get to the point. How many times have you said that to your children? What do you want? Because they speak all around it trying to butter you up or whatever, right? Well, these patients don't do that on purpose. You're asking them a question, and they speak all around what you've just asked them, and then when they stop talking, they still haven't answered your question. But they spent 10 minutes telling you. They have a bad point of communication because they have a lot of unnecessary and tedious details. By the time they get so bogged down with all the unnecessary details, they forgot what they were really answering. Tangentiality, mutism, and preservation. Your tangentiality is the inability to get to the point of communication due to the introduction of so many more topics. They'll start out answering your question and then introduce a new topic and a new topic and a new topic, and you have to say, but wait a minute, let's go back. That's very interesting, but let's go back and talk about how'd you sleep last night, because that's what you ask them. And they'll start out something maybe like, well, I slept okay, but yesterday this man came in my room and he was wearing a red shirt, and that red shirt made me think about, and you're going, you slept okay. Let's go back to that. You slept okay. That's your tangentiality. Your mutism speaks for itself or doesn't. Mutism is no verbiage, either because they choose not to speak or they have the inability to speak because of their mental illness. Preservation is the persistent repetition of the same word or same idea in response to very different questions. You ask them something and they respond with this sentence. It didn't make sense, so you're like, okay, we'll talk about something else. So you ask them the next line of questions and they respond with that same sentence or that same event. That's all they can think about. All they want to talk about was, maybe when they got committed. And that's all they want to talk about. And you ask them something else, and they kind of blow that off and say, yeah, but when the police came, or when, and it's the same topic, or the same word, or the same sentence, over and over and over, regardless of how many different ways you try to ask them a different question. Makes communication take a while. Perception. Perception is key, wouldn't you agree? If you perceive a threat, you react to it. And then you may realize it wasn't a threat if you're able to change that thought process. For your individuals who have those altered perceptions and impaired realities, everything may look like a threat to them. They may perceive everything in a different way. Hallucinations are your false sensory perceptions. They're not associated with any real external stimuli. They usually involve your 5 senses, hearing, seeing, tasting, smelling, or feel or touch. So they can have an auditory hallucination, and they hear things that other people don't hear. There is no external stimuli causing them to hear those bells ringing. There's no bells. Or they can have a visual hallucination. They can see shadows that they think are, maybe somebody following them, and they see that shadow everywhere they look. That person's behind them, and they see it. They can have tactile hallucinations. They can feel things. They feel actual touch, and there's no one there to touch them. Gustatory is taste, and olfactory is smell. Hearing voices is the most commonly associated hallucination, but it's not the only hallucination. So if your patient isn't hearing voices, they may have a different type of a hallucination. But for schizophrenics, hearing voices does affect about 70% of your schizophrenics. So it is the most common, the more likely one that they have. It's just not the only one. For these individuals experiencing hallucination, instead of hearing just their name, voices may produce a stream of speech to them, and they can't weed it out. Sometimes the hallucinations are very vulgar. Sometimes they're very derogatory and hateful and demeaning. And sometimes they're just the opposite. Sometimes they're building you up all the time and telling you how smart you are and how wonderful you are, and people should respect you. People should understand who you are. So, I mean, it could be either or maybe they have a combination of voices that tear them down and voices that build them up. An illusion, with an I, illusion, that's a misinterpretation of a real external stimuli. Something real exists in the external environment, but it's the patient's perception of that real object that is impaired. So with hallucinations, there's nothing real in the environment that is causing them, but with an illusion, there is something we can all agree on that is there. We all agree that projector is here in the middle of the room with us. I agree that it's a projector and it's only going to project my PowerPoints, and your patient might think that it is actually a way for the government to spy on him and to read his thoughts and to see into his personal belief system. We can all agree the projector exists, but we don't quite agree on what it does. So that's an illusion. Something in the external environment does exist, but it's the patient's perception of that object that is causing the illusion. Does that help with the differences of delusions, hallucinations? Okay. A sense of self. Everyone has a sense of who they are. It's the uniqueness and the individuality that you feel that makes you who you are. Individual experiences, your realities, your memories, this is all what helps to develop your characteristics that make you who you are. So the individual experiences, in this case, a sense of unreality about who and where and what they are, about how their body exists, where they begin and stop, how to interact with the environment, where do they fit in or belong. They don't have that clear-cut, concise ability to separate. Echolalia. Echolalia is the repeating of words that they hear. You know that game that drives you crazy where your children repeat everything you say? Even when you tell them, stop saying that. Stop saying that. Okay, that's echolalia, and some patients suffer from that, and they will repeat what they hear. Maybe not the whole sentence, certainly not a conversation, but maybe just words that they're hearing, and they'll repeat it. We had a gentleman on the unit for quite some time. He didn't interact much with anybody. He said his own little random thoughts, and he went around. But he could be sitting in the corner thumbing through a magazine quickly, and someone over here was talking, and he would catch one word of what they were saying, and he would just start repeating it. Just the one word. Until a new word hit him, and then he would repeat that one for a while. Echopraxia are the repeated movements that are observed. You know how your little children like to follow you around and do what you do, and they'll watch you, and if you're stirring, they'll stir? Well, that's echopraxia. That's the repeated movements that you're observing. Identification and imitation. This is taking one of the form of behaviors that one observes in another and imitating it or identifying with it. If they see a quality about you that they like, they just take on that quality. They just borrow or imitate what they see in you that they like. They identify with you by having the same. Oh, you're a nursing student? I'm a nurse too. You help people? That's what I do. I help people. You see what I'm saying? And then depersonalization is a feeling of unreality. They just don't personally attach to anything. Things just really don't become that important to them because they can't attach themselves to it. They don't have meaning associated with it. So they have depersonalization, that feeling of unreality. Our negative symptoms. Affect is the feeling, state, or emotional tone. Inappropriate affect. Well, what is considered normal, healthy people have inappropriate affects sometimes? Yeah? Think so? What about emotions that are over the top or a little bit incongruent with what's going on? I mean, wow, they really overreacted to that. but they're normal, healthy people. Okay. So what did we say about positive symptoms? That's the psychotic symptoms that we do not see in normally healthy people. Negative symptoms, what we're talking about here, still not great behaviors, but we can see them in what we consider normal people, right? Negative symptoms are associated with disruptions to normal emotions and behaviors. They're a little bit harder to recognize as part of schizophrenia because we can see them in so many other environments. They can be mistaken sometimes for depression or for other conditions. A flat or a bland affect can be associated with schizophrenia as a negative symptom. But how many people did you encounter today with a flat or a bland affect? And they're not schizophrenic. Not that we know of. A person's face is flat or bland in affect. That's what's said to happen when they don't actually change their facial expressions or they talk in a very dull and monotonous voice. Very flat or bland. Now, people with negative symptoms need help with their everyday tasks sometimes. They often have neglect, and we're talking about our schizophrenic patients now. When they experience negative symptoms, they oftentimes will neglect their personal basic hygiene. It may make them seem lazy, or you may think that they are unwilling to help themselves, but the problem is that these symptoms, these negative symptoms, make them not want to bathe. Schizophrenia can also affect a person's mood, not just in schizoaffective disorder, when we said that's the schizophrenic symptoms and mood disorder symptoms. But schizophrenia itself can affect mood. It can cause severe mood swings. It can cause irritability, hostility. It can cause depression itself. Negative symptoms refer to the diminished or the absent characteristics of what normal people have too, normal function. They either have a diminished or an absent characteristic of normal function. They may appear months or years before the positive symptoms. Now remember, the positive symptoms were what we don't see in normal healthy people. So you might see somebody that used to shower every day. Now they shower every third day. And as the negative symptoms progress, they showered a week ago, maybe, they're not sure, and then they just quit showering. So we can see some negative symptoms in people that are not considered schizophrenics. We just call that poor hygiene. But negative symptoms can exist in healthy people. They are just accentuated and more determinant in people with schizophrenia. But as I said, sometimes they're difficult to associate with schizophrenia for a long period of time. They may be present for months or even years before we see the actual psychotic symptoms, the positive symptoms. Volition is an impairment in the ability to initiate a goal-directed activity. Well, some days I have volition. Some days I'm impaired in my ability to get out there and make a goal and follow through with it. It is that reduced ability to plan or carry out any activity for your schizophrenic patients that start them with several tasks. They will start numerous things and finish none of them. Like, start a shower, well, I got all my stuff together. Start to get dressed and come out half-dressed. Start to brush their teeth and only get the toothpaste on the brush. Those types of really normal activities that they can't initiate and follow through with. They require some assistance, some encouragement, some verbal prompting. Emotional ambivalence is a coexistence of opposite emotions toward the same object, person, or situation. The only way I can compare this is to take your children. Again, the children get a bad rap, right? They love you, but when you have to impose rules or regulations, they're so mad at you they can't stand you. But they love you. That's kind of an emotional ambivalence. It's that coexistence in that one schizophrenic patient and they have opposite emotions toward the same object, the same person, or the same situation. They don't want to go to group. You're going to have to just make them go to group. But then when they get there, they talk the whole time. But when they come back, I can't believe you made me go to group. I hate that group. I hate that instructor. I hate all of them. But then you go and talk to the instructor of the group, and they talked the whole time. They actively participated. So they feel some different emotional responses about the same situation, topic, or person. Thank you. She said that sounds like a teenager. Emotional ambivalence. Yep, it does. Impaired interpersonal functioning and relationship to the external world. Can you see with everything that we've talked about, including this assessment and these negative symptoms, where they can have an impaired functioning with their relationship in the external world? Yeah. Well, then we're going to add some things. Autism. We are talking about across a lifespan. And autism patients tend to focus inward on their own little fantasy world. We see autism a lot in your younger children, but a schizophrenic patient can also withdraw inwardly, right? We said that in the beginning. Deterioration in their appearance. They become very impaired in their personal hygiene, their self-care activities. And this can be someone who, prior to the diagnosis, spent a lot of time on their hair and their makeup and their clothing and appearances that now don't even shower, let alone brush their hair and put makeup on and brush their teeth. People with schizophrenia often seem, to the outsider looking in, as a very inappropriate and odd individual. But it is that mental illness that is causing the difficulty with their ability to engage in their environment. It causes people to avoid them, which only adds to their withdrawing into themselves. It adds to their social isolation. And if nobody sees you and nobody comes to visit and you don't have any friends, why bother to shower anyway? Now all the depression starts. They have no support system, and they don't even understand why. Okay, psychomotor behavior. Inertia is the deficiency of energy. How many of you are experiencing inertia today? Even though you had a good long break, that inertia is still there. I have no energy. I have a deficiency of energy. Waxy flexibility. This is kind of like that catatonic stupor that I talked about, that slowed down psychomotor retardation. If your patient has waxy flexibility, they have a complete passive yielding of all of their movable parts of the body, and any effort that they make at placing them in certain positions won't work. They might want to move their arm and scratch their head, but they just can't make it happen. They just cannot pick that arm up and make it work. And in the same way, if someone came along behind you and positioned your patient in a specific way, they would stay in that position until they were moved into another position. If you set them down, cross their legs, prop their arm up, you go back to look at somebody who's having waxy flexibility and that total deficient energy and that inability to do anything for themselves, they're going to be sitting in that same chair with the same leg crossed and that arm propped up, just like you left them. They will posture, or they may pace or rock. Now, posturing is voluntary. That is the voluntary assumption of inappropriate or bizarre postures. You may see someone standing over in the corner pointing at the ceiling, or they may stand around and, grin, look at the ceiling all the time. They may stand and jump and bounce. It's voluntary posturing. Strange, bizarre. Pacing and rocking, that's just what it says. They're pacing the floors, or they're rocking back and forth in the chair. They're rocking their body. Yes. Posturing is voluntary. No, they're in control of their movements. They will stand there as long as they want to. It may be 5 minutes or 10 minutes, but they're in control of their ability to move. But if it's waxy flexibility, they don't have control over those movements, and you can actually move them like a little doll, a little rubber doll, and they'll stay in that movement because they don't have. It's not voluntary. Posturing is voluntary for these patients. Weird and bizarre postures, but voluntary, and they can change it and they can move on when they get ready to. Let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break before we move on to the next. When we talk about continuing to assess your patient for their symptoms, some associated features that you might be able to see in your patient, anhedonia is one, and that is the inability to experience pleasure from activities that they formerly enjoyed doing. Something that might have been a hobby or was very important to them or they were very passionate about, now it just doesn't seem to hold the same value any longer. Regression, this is when your patient retreats to an earlier level of development. Asociality is the inability to empathize, that the way that we feel intimate with other people and we share emotions and we can understand kind of what they're going through. They don't have that. They don't have the ability to form that close relationship with others if they're experiencing asociality. Alogia, that's a poverty of speech. And a general lack of additional unprompted content seen in normal speech. They just don't initiate conversation. They'll answer your questions, but it's usually yes, no, one word, as quickly as they can with an answer, and they don't initiate conversation with you. You find that you have to really, it's like pulling teeth, you really have to ask questions, get an answer. Ask more questions, get an answer. Every time you try to lead them out on a path and get them to elaborate some, you fall to a dead end. Alogia as a symptom, it's commonly seen in your patients that have schizophrenia. It is considered a negative symptom, though. Avolition is a general lack of desire, drive, or motivation to pursue meaningful goals. They just don't care about starting new tasks or following through or meeting goals. That's your avolition. We talked about that a little bit. They lack that motivation, that pursuit. A schizophrenic patient experiencing avolition might show very little participation in their work, or they have very little interest in socializing with others. They may sit still for long periods of time. Some nursing diagnoses, disturbed thought process may be related to, and then you would pick the ones that, apply to your patient. Either related to the inability to trust or panic anxiety, possible hereditary factors, biochemical factors, disturbed sensory, perceptual, auditory, and visual. Like for this patient, they're having auditory hallucinations and visual hallucinations related to their panic anxiety or extreme loneliness, withdrawal into self, related to hearing voices, related to seeing shadows they believe are out to hurt them, or whatever it is that's related specifically to your patient. You could also use social isolation for these patients, risk for violence. All of those would be really good nursing diagnoses. Outcomes. What are we talking about as far as our outcomes? Anytime you look at measurable goals, it should start off with the client will. The goals are never about us, same as with medical surgical care plans. What do you want the client to be able to do when you have all of these interventions in place? The client will. And that's all you want to know about your outcomes. Where am I leading my patient to? In planning and implementation, these are our interventions. When planning and intervening for our clients with schizophrenia or with other psychotic disorders, Different places will use different models to go by. Some places you still handwrite your care plans. North Alabama Regional is moving away from that, but right now they're still handwriting a lot of them. A lot of your facilities will have care plans that are already written up, and you just check whatever applies, and it's, Nursing interventions for the client with schizophrenia are aimed at decreasing the anxiety, if anxiety is the problem. You have to establish trust with that patient. They already have problems with their reality, so they don't know you from Adam's house cat, and you're in here asking them all kinds of personal questions. So you got to start with a little bit of rapport and trust building. Assist your client to define and test reality if at all possible. Goes back to those delusions, persecutory, those disorders, what is real and what is not. Encourage them to interact with others to improve their social interaction, decrease their withdrawal. And when I say withdrawal, I mean withdrawal into self, that social isolation. Reassure them and reassure them again of their safety in the environment and that you are here to help. Meet their self-care needs. If they can't do it, then you encourage them. And if you have to actually help them and follow through with that, then that's what we do as the healthcare professional in the psychiatric setting. You will not have to do that in your clinical rotations this semester. But staff there will encourage and verbally prompt and assist if needed, or completely do. If your patient's so very sick and they're having so many positive symptoms and so many negative symptoms that they just cannot take care of themselves at this point, which is likely why they're hospitalized, right? They still have to have their hygiene maintained. So if you work in the psychiatric facility, you will still have to follow through with things like that. But as a nursing student, you're not expected to give a paranoid schizophrenic patient a bath. Promote and adapt them with their family coping. Meet with the family members who are active in their participation and active in their care. In case management models, you'll see that some of the plan of care may take a form of a critical pathway. Your chapters has some critical pathways in some of the tables there for you. Did you need me? Okay, client and family education. As I said earlier in the lecture, schizophrenia, it requires the entire family to be educated because so many people do not understand what their family member is suffering from or what causes them to act in the way that they do. So there's a lot of frustration, anxiety, and, anxiety builds to hostility and different forms of acting out just simply because they don't understand. The family members need a lot of educational coping and support. They need to find places in the community that they can get some support from. Coping with an illness as serious as schizophrenia can be very challenging, both for the patient and for the family members. We want them to learn. We want our family members to learn about schizophrenia. Educate them about the condition, how to motivate the person with the disease to stick to their treatment plan, to keep taking their medications, to educate with the friends and family to understand the condition and be more compassionate with this schizophrenic patient when they cycle back around or when they start to show some breakthrough symptoms and psychosis. Educate your patient and family members and friends to join a support group so that they can talk with other people that are also experiencing what they're experiencing and can draw from their experience and use it and motivate them. Stay focused on goals. We want to educate them to recover from schizophrenia. It takes a lifelong process. It is an ongoing process. We want to keep their recovery goals in mind so that they can motivate themselves to stay on their medications and continue with their therapies. Loved ones need to remember to take the responsibility for managing the illness as well as the patient. You have to kind of ask, did you remember to take your meds this morning? Has anything changed? Are you out of any of your medicines? You seem to be a little bit different today. Are you having any problems today that you didn't think you were having yesterday? Is something new going on? I'm noticing a change. Sometimes they will be a little bit gun-shy, and every change will be a big deal, but we want to educate them. The patient and the family members do need to learn some relaxation and stress management. It's a very stressful diagnosis for the patient and the family. Some things that have been useful in the past that the patients have been able to use were meditation, yoga, some different kinds of focusing on their energies to help manage their illness. People with schizophrenia often lack an awareness that their difficulties stem from the mental illness and that this difficulty requires medication and medical attention and healthcare professionals. It's hard to talk someone who is very paranoid into going to see a total stranger and taking medications from that stranger. It's very difficult to convince them that what they're feeling is part of an illness that medication can help resolve. So then it usually falls on the family members to find them help. Maybe their friends to talk them into going to see someone. It's very difficult to do. Individual relaxation therapy helps to cope with stress and identify early warning signs of relapse. Social skills training. This focuses on improving communication and social interactions. The use of role play to teach the client appropriate eye contact, interpersonal skills, voice, tone, how to say what you say, posture, and so on. It's all improved at, It is all intended to improve their relationship development in their social settings or in their personal settings, work settings. Again, family therapy will provide support and education to the families that are dealing with a schizophrenic patient. Vocational rehabilitation and supportive employment focuses on helping people with schizophrenia find and then maintain and keep a job. Individual psychotherapy. Individual psychotherapy usually goes on for a long period of time. It is a long-term therapeutic approach. It's kind of difficult because of the client's impairment in their interpersonal functioning and to stick with it for such a long period of time and to adhere to it. Group therapy, there is some success if the patient participates over a long-term course of group therapy with the schizophrenia. Group therapy tends to be a little bit less successful or less beneficial if it's only done for a short period of time. Behavior therapy. What we've seen in behavior therapy, the chief drawback of this has been the inability to generalize the community setting after the client's discharged from a treatment facility. After they learn how to behave in the treatment facility or in the hospital and they go to their groups and they socialize with other patients who have mental illnesses and are not judging or looking at, and how do you take that behavior therapy and then apply it when you're at Walmart or at church or in your social settings or your community settings? So that's the only drawback we've seen with behavior therapy. It's difficult for the patients to use what they learn in real life situations in the community. There are a lot of support systems. Several are listed here. But what basically a new patient with schizophrenia diagnosis doesn't realize is that they exist, that these different support systems are out there in the community for them to be able to use. So a lot of times just educating them that they have these support systems in place is something they didn't know, and they can use them. So when you're looking at how to evaluate your care that you're giving for the schizophrenic patient, are they able to connect with at least one staff member? So that when they get, confused or upset, is there at least one staff member that they seem to always respond to more appropriately than the others? Is their anxiety level being maintained? Look at them. Do they look like they're experiencing any mild, moderate, severe, or certainly panic anxiety needs to be treated? Are they still delusional? Sometimes you have to talk to them a while till you get back to the delusions because sometimes they get better at covering the delusions. Are they able to stop when they can find themselves escalating? Are they able to interrupt that level of anxiety that they can feel getting higher? Have we taught them anything about stress reduction? Do they still become so easily agitated? What's really going on? Does everything set them off? Is the client able to interact with others appropriately now? Maybe that was a big deal before they came in, and they were getting into a lot of social settings that landed them in inappropriate responses and jail, and are they able to change that behavior any? Some treatment modalities that are in your syllabus or were in your syllabus last semester as well, I believe. You just want to go back and familiarize yourself with those. The milieu therapy, the milieu is the environment. That's what milieu means. You want your milieu to be very therapeutic for the patient. You can't have 10 patients all cursing, screaming, and throwing furniture on the same unit. That's not therapeutic for anybody. You want to maintain a therapeutic environment. And of course, the therapeutic environment is best when it's used in conjunction with medications to help control internal thoughts and internal behaviors. Family therapy is aimed at helping family members cope with the long-term effects of the illness. This patient is not going to get better to the point that they will no longer need the medicine. They're never going to be the person that you knew before that first psychotic break. This is forever. That's very depressing when you're that family member or that parent or that spouse. The Assertive Community Treatment Act, or ACT team, they have ACT teams in place. This is a program that takes the approach of a full team, trying to provide comprehensive, community-based psychiatric treatment. It involves rehab facilities, support persons out in the community, so that your persons with serious mental illnesses can find someone to call, or their family members can find someone to call. A lot of times they don't know that people exist that can help them. These ACT teams, and they are composed of psychiatrists, nurses, social workers, vocational rehab therapists, substance abuse counselors, and there's usually someone on call and available to be reached every day of the year, 24 hours a day, to help with crisis interventions. In the person's home, they may have neighborhood meetings. They may be meeting at local restaurants where, the back room is able to have some type of closed-off meeting where it's not interrupted. Sometimes they will be able to meet with the clients in parks, different places. That helps with getting your clients involved if they don't feel like they have to go to a hospital every time to talk to a shrink. They can just talk to a normal person sitting at the park, and they feel better about their therapy. And when they feel better about their therapy, they're more likely to continue it. So the ACT teams are very instrumental in helping that. Their primary goal is listed here on the slide. We want them to meet their needs, improve their function, enhance their ability to live, decrease all of the symptoms that are causing all of the problems, and to try to minimize how many times that acute, recurrent psychotic episode happens, how many times they cycle. We try to minimize that. So as the cornerstone of treatment is medications, that's what we're going to spend the last few minutes talking about, are the medications. Because as we've gotten up to this point, do you believe that schizophrenia is a brain disorder? Do you believe that this brain disorder can be treated without any medications or any hospitalization? Did someone say yes? No? I didn't think so. If they could control this behavior, don't you think they would? If they could be, quote unquote, normal and live in society and have a job and a relationship and all of the things that they desire to have, don't you think that they would do that? And if they could find a way to do that in the community, they would have already done so? That's what leads up to being the cornerstone of medication in the treatment of schizophrenia. your antipsychotics, also known as your neuroleptics. Those are interchangeable terms. You have conventional, typical, and atypical antipsychotics. They do help to decrease agitation, and they do help to decrease those psychotic symptoms we talked about, the hallucinations, the delusions, the illusions. But because these medications for your schizophrenic patients do carry a risk for very serious side effects, people with schizophrenia are very reluctant to take them. And then if they're suffering from the type of schizophrenic class of paranoia, well, they certainly don't want to take them. Antipsychotics or neuroleptics medications are most commonly prescribed for your schizophrenics than any other mental illness. They're thought to control symptoms by affecting the brain neurotransmitters. We talked about those neurotransmitters. Sometimes we've got too much of one and not enough of another. So we think that the way these antipsychotics help is because they help to alter the chemical balance of the brain, those neurotransmitters. Most often we're talking about dopamine and serotonin. It does require a person's willingness to cooperate with the treatment. If they are not willing to cooperate with treatment and they are refusing to take medications, that's going to affect what choice of medications that we give them. Some medications are only offered or most beneficial in certain forms. And if they're only offered or they're most beneficial in a pill form, and your patient is sitting in front of you telling you, I'm not taking it. I'm not taking it now, and I'm certainly not taking it when I leave. That may not be an option for that patient. You may have to go to something else to administer that patient, maybe an IM medication. So a person's willingness to cooperate with treatment sometimes affects the medication choice. Someone who is uncooperative may have to be given those injections, and some of the injections we can give last for longer periods of time. Someone who is agitated may also, on top of the antipsychotic, require something for anxiety. So they need to be calmed down at least initially when they come in very upset and very anxious and very psychotic. Maybe initially they need to be given some kind of a benzodiazepine, anxiolytic, till we can control the anxiety level, and an antipsychotic to control the psychosis that they're having. Usually what we'll see given with anxiety as it goes as a symptom along with schizophrenia is Ativan. So your patient may be on Ativan and an antipsychotic. It just depends on what the symptoms are as to what we're going to treat. How high, I don't know. I've seen them give up to 8 milligrams of Ativan in about a 16-hour period. But it depends on the patient. Thorazine, Prolixin, and Haldol. These are your conventional or typical antipsychotics. These medications have frequent and potential significant neurological side effects. Some of those side effects include the possibility of developing a movement disorder that is called tardive dyskinesia. Tardive dyskinesia is a movement disorder that can possibly develop when someone is taking an antipsychotic medication. That's one of the symptoms of tardive dyskinesia. Yes, they have that tongue movement. It thrusts and protrudes out of their mouth, or it could be tremors, coarse tremors. There's a lot of different ways that tardive dyskinesia can manifest itself, but all of those are brought on by administering the antipsychotic. So right there's one reason why patients may not want to take it. They're not in control of that movement disorder that you've caused by giving them the antipsychotic. They'd rather have their delusions than have all these awkward tics and movements and speech impediments. The kicker with tardive dyskinesia is that it may or may not be reversed even when you stop the medication. that is causing it. Sometimes the tardive dyskinesias are permanent, even when you stop the medication that is causing it. When we talk about tardive dyskinesias, we're talking about, as I said, movements of the tongue, lips. Sometimes it's lip smacking, abnormal facial movements, movements of the trunk and extremities. Arms and legs can be affected. Usually, you see the tardive dyskinesias that can't be reversed occur in patients that have been on antipsychotics for a long period of time. They've been on them for X amount of years, and then they start developing these symptoms of tardive dyskinesia. They have to come off of the medication, but the symptoms continue. Because usually when we first initiate the medication, if we begin to see some of these abnormal movements, we can stop the medication. And a lot of the times the movements will go away if it's just a newly initiated med. Sometimes, if they've tried other antipsychotics that have not been beneficial and have not controlled the psychosis, and we get to the last resort antipsychotic and it is controlling the psychosis, but now it's causing the movements, sometimes they will elect to leave that patient on the medication and to try to start a different medicine to combat the symptoms. Maybe a anticholinergic like Cogentin, or maybe a benzo like Ativan, to try to keep them on the medicine even though it's causing these abnormal movements in their body, but it's controlling their psychosis. So just because a patient is having these abnormal movements on their antipsychotic does not always mean they will stop the antipsychotic. They will give them something else to try to combat it, or they may have to stop it. Prolixin comes in an injection form that is called prolixin decanoate. Anytime you have a decanoate stuck on the end of it, it's going to be a long-term, long-acting injection. Prolixin decanoate can be given every 3 weeks. So for these patients who are really, really poor compliant with medication regimen and they just don't take it, maybe a decanoate antipsychotic would be the choice because they don't have to have it so frequently. Certainly not 2 or 3 times a day or even daily or weekly. Prolixin decanoate can be given every 3 weeks. Haldol decanoate, your Haldol decanoate can be given every 4 weeks or monthly. If your patient is on Haldol decanoate, what they'll usually do is when they give that first Haldec, whatever day of the week that is, the 25th, not day of the week, but day of the month, they'll do it on the 25th of every month. And that's when they'll set it up for patients that have their Haldol decanoates. It is an IM injection also. Now, I'll let you look over all of these side effects that are potential to develop with any of your antipsychotics, and just pick out 1 or 2 of them that you'd rather have if you had to have them. Yeah, there's not any up there. There's none up there that you would choose to have. Okay? It can take several weeks after first starting the medication to notice any improvement in their symptoms of psychosis, but a lot of times these side effects will be in the first couple days. So they're still going to be psychotic and they're going to have some of these things going on. Try to talk that person into taking that pill again. Do you see the trouble there? In general, the goal of treatment with your antipsychotic medications is to effectively control the signs and the symptoms at the lowest possible dosage to cause the least amount of side effects that we can possibly cause to our patient. If a low dose doesn't work, they have to increase the dose. If you increase the dose, you increase the side effects. The psychiatrist may try very different medications. They may try this one medication and then increase it until, they're as high as they can give it and it doesn't work. And they may titrate that one down and start another one. Then you have weeks and weeks of therapy to titrate that one up to see if it works. Maybe it does and maybe it doesn't. If it controls partially the psychosis, maybe your patient has to take more than one antipsychotic, each carrying a potential of these side effects. And just because they didn't get the side effect from one antipsychotic does not mean they won't get that side effect from another antipsychotic. So we're trying to reach our desired result, which is to control the psychosis at the lowest dose on the lowest number of pills we can give them. And it's a hit and miss. It's like a puzzle. Other medications also may be helpful, such as antidepressants, anti-anxiety, which we've already talked about a little bit. These are your typical medications that we've been talking about. There are your atypicals. These are your newer ones. Your atypical antipsychotics still have side effects, and they still have the potential of causing all of those side effects you just saw, but they have less of a potential for causing them. Your atypicals are your newer ones and have less of a potential to cause all of the side effects. They still can because they're antipsychotics. And all antipsychotics can cause those side effects. We just don't see them as often or to as an extreme than we did with someone who was taking the typicals. Abilify, Clozaril, Zyprexa, Invega, Seroquel, Risperdal, and Geodon. The side effects of atypical antipsychotic medications usually include things like weight gain, which is not a desirable side effect either, diabetes, and high blood cholesterol. Okay, well that's a trade-off for all of the others that we just looked at on the other slide, because typically on your atypicals you'll get that kind of side effect, but you still have the possibility of the other side effects that come with the typicals as well. I'm going to get to that. So therefore, when we say that, your typicals are not preferred over your atypicals, usually by your patients or by your physicians. They're going to try to get your patient on an atypical because the side effects are less or to a lesser degree. They pose a lower risk of the very debilitating side effects that we've been talking about than the typicals or conventionals do. The Food and Drug Administration has approved the two that you see with asterisks, your Abilify and Risperdal, for use in ages 13 to 17 now. We used to not have any medication that was approved for these psychotic symptoms. But the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has now approved Abilify and Risperdal for use to control psychotic symptoms in people ages 13 to 17. The family teaching that goes along with these antipsychotics is in your book on page 625. Extrapyramidal symptoms, called EPS, also come along with antipsychotic medications. Was there a question? I just said there was some family teaching on page 625. EPS, let's talk a little bit about EPS. The incidence of EPS may vary with age. It may vary with the gender, the drug, and the dosage. Antipsychotic drugs do risk causing your patient to suffer EPS, but they do vary considerably and largely between typical and atypical antipsychotics. Your atypical antipsychotics are usually the ones we want to give because they have a decreased risk than the typicals. Anti-Parkinson agents may be prescribed if your patient is experiencing symptoms of EPS because it looks a lot like a Parkinson's patient. It mimics those movements that a Parkinson's patient will have. So it makes sense that we could give an anti-Parkinson drug to help decrease some of those movements that this antipsychotic is causing. They also will use benzodiazepines to help control that pseudo-Parkinsonism. Pseudo-Parkinsonism is a reversible syndrome that does look a lot like a Parkinson's patient. It comes from the dopamine blocking agents in the antipsychotics. Remember I said that we're usually talking about dopamine and serotonin when we give antipsychotics and kind of manipulate the neurotransmitters. Well, when we do manipulate and block out the action of the dopamine, that's what causes those mimicking symptoms of Parkinson's, that pseudo-Parkinsonism. Sometimes that's referred to as a drug-induced Parkinsonism. Akinesia. Akinesia is an absence or a loss of control over voluntary muscle movements. Our antipsychotics can cause EPS, and one of the symptoms of EPS is akinesia. We're giving them this medication to control their psychosis, and they can't move anymore. Yeah, you got to stop that medicine. Akathisia. If your patient experiences akathisia, I'm not positive that's spelled right. Akathisia is the feeling of an inner restlessness. You see a lot of commercials on TV now for restless leg syndrome, and it is that feeling of inner restlessness, that constant urge for your patient to be moving. It is very peculiar in that while the patient cannot sit still, they cannot stop moving, their actual movements are completely voluntary. They get up and move and walk and shift positions completely voluntary because they have that inner need or that restlessness to move and stay active and shift positions and walk and pace and get up, sit down. Dystonia. Dystonia is a movement disorder which causes involuntary contractions by your muscles. Dystonia is like a muscle rigidity or a pulling or a drawing of the muscles that they cannot control. It is involuntary. It looks like contractions. It results in twisting and repetitive movements. Benzodiazepines can be given to help control dystonia also. Benzos can also be used to help with akathisia. I didn't say that, but they can. The next EPS symptom is oculogyric crisis. You'll know if you see a patient experiencing oculogyric crisis. It is very spastic movements of the eyeballs, usually into a fixed position that is upward. Their eyes just move around very erratic and spontaneous, but usually they will move and fixate upwardly. It can persist for several minutes or hours. Or if the patient has to continue on that antipsychotic like we talked about a minute ago, it may be that the majority of the time they stand around staring upward. And they'll make eye contact with you and then go back to staring upward. They'll answer your question and then stare upward. We have a patient on the floor that does that because of the antipsychotic that he's on. Usually, oculogyric crisis is an acute dystonic reaction, that involuntary movement disorder. Antipsychotics also have the potential of causing neuroleptic malignant syndrome symptoms, or NMS. Y'all kind of getting why the patients don't want to take them? But you just said there's a need for them. You just said you got to take these medicines if you get this diagnosis. So the symptoms of NMS. Now NMS is more rare than EPS. NMS doesn't occur as often as you see the symptoms of EPS, but it is life-threatening. It is an idiosyncratic reaction. We certainly don't expect to see it. It is related to administering the antipsychotics. What you will see in someone experiencing NMS is a high fever, muscular rigidity, an altered mental status, and autonomic dysfunction. Your atypicals and your typicals both have the potential to cause NMS. Clozapine has been associated with the development of NMS, but then clozapine seems to be less likely to manifest the EPS symptoms. Even though EPS is more common than NMS, clozaril seems to have more times that someone experiences NMS. In general, over the past 30 years, NMS has been associated with a variety of drugs that lead to a decrease in the dopamine receptor activation in the brain. NMS has been associated with a variety of drugs, all of which tend to lead to a decreased dopamine receptor activation in the brain. Client and family education is just so important because you need to teach the client and family what to look for as potential side effects after they've been on the med for a long time. We don't always think about that. A lot of these side effects show up after they're good or better and they get sent home. So you teach your patient and your family to continue to look for different side effects, the EPS, the NMS. Do not stop taking their medication abruptly. And all of the other things that, go along. You want to wear sunscreen and protective clothing because sometimes you're more hypersensitive to burning. If you're receiving clozapine therapy, that patient's going to have to go to the doctor weekly. They have to get blood levels drawn. A lot of people don't like to have blood levels drawn, but if you're taking that medication, that's essential. They won't give them too much of the medication. Now doctors, I know this says to obtain a weekly supply of the drug, but now the doctors are sending them home with 2-week supplies, sometimes in some cases up to a month if they have, support systems in place and people that will help oversee that. Do not drink alcohol while they're on any neuroleptic therapy or antipsychotics. You have to be very careful about drug interactions. So they can't just start taking other drugs. Even over-the-counter drugs can cause interactions with our antipsychotics. So they just need to call ahead, make sure that their medical doctor has a list of their antipsychotics from their psychiatrist. Another medicine that requires a lot of family education, and you'll hear a lot about this one, is lithium. Lithium is a mood stabilizer. Can you see where someone with schizophrenia might need a mood stabilizer with all of the other symptoms that are going on? Especially if they're having what we talked about being associated with schizophrenia as those manic episodes or any depression. They might need a mood stabilizer, and it's usually lithium. And we're going to talk a lot about lithium when we talk about mood disorders. But your schizophrenic patients can also be on lithium. Anyone taking lithium also is going to require frequent and scheduled blood levels to be drawn. So you can't start someone on lithium and not have them be cooperative with their blood draws. Once or twice a week with the initial treatment of lithium is required. After we get past the initial treatment with the lithium and they get kind of stabilized, then we can go to monthly blood draws, but then that's going to continue. So they're going to have a way to get up there and get their blood drawn, be responsible enough to come get their blood drawn, and be there every time their blood's supposed to be drawn. Anytime they're drawing a lithium level, it should be drawn 12 hours after the last dose they received. So, for example, if they took a 9 p.m. dose before they went to bed, then we can draw their lithium level at 9 a.m. in the morning. On page 623, it talks about lithium. You need to commit this to memory. You need to write this down. The therapeutic dose for lithium for someone who just came in the hospital and is experiencing acute mania is 1 to 1.5. Well, after we get their mania under control, and maybe their antipsychotic is helping with their psychosis, we do not want them discharged on that level of lithium. We want to decrease that level of lithium to what we call a maintenance dose. So initially, we hit them hard and heavy, and it's a higher dose for a higher level. We start to control them. We start to get that mood in place, those psychotic symptoms, and then we go to the maintenance dose, which is 0.6 to 1.2. That's where we want them when we send them home. That's where we want them to stay. There is a very narrow window between therapeutic and toxic for lithium. The symptoms of toxicity with lithium begin typically at 1.5. They can begin earlier than 1.5. But we said we wanted to keep them a maintenance dose at 0.6 to 1.2. That's a really narrow window, right? The symptoms of toxicity can begin earlier than 1.5, but usually we see them at 1.5. Our dose for the acutely manic patient was up to 1.5, so we can get them toxic in our attempt to control their manic phase. You need to read over the symptoms of toxicity because they are dose determinant. You need to read over the family teaching that is associated with lithium, teaching them what to look for.